By the end of Warlords of Draenor, World of Warcraft was not in a good way. The comparable desert of content, scrapped ideas, updates that were literally just a new mission table to click, ruined economy, severe lack of replayable endgame content, and subsequent mass exodus of players, causing Blizzard to withhold their sub count, which up to that point had been on the decline. Expansion to expansion meant that Legion had to be good. It just had to be. MMO competitors were smelling blood in the water at Blizzard, and were on the precipice of taking a bigger and bigger bite out of the once loyal player base who had seen such a sad decline of their beloved developer. I think Legion had one of the weakest receptions a new expansion has ever seen. Well, maybe not more so than Pandaria, but people were more wary now. People wanted to see some real content before willingly jumping back into the world of Azeroth, especially since our Warlords of Draenor promised so many things but ended up giving so little in the end. On top of this, Warlords of Draenor didn't even last 2 years in length. It released on 13th of November 2014 and Legion released on the 30th of August 2016, making this the shortest cycle between expansion to expansion we had ever seen. People thought, here we go, Legion's just going to be rush garbage to try and put a band-aid over the train wreck that Warlords of Draenor ended up being, and well, I'm happy to say that this was wrong. It was so very, very wrong, because I think overall Legion was incredible. This was some of the best content Blizzard has done in years. It was packed to the brim with new stuff to do. I personally hadn't been so invested in the game since the early days. In fact, the return of the Burning Legion was a return to form for Blizzard, and the vast majority of the expansion was masterfully executed, and it changed such a massive amount of things that we've become used to over the years and made them better or different in a number of ways. We have so much to cover here. Let's talk about how Legion changed World of Warcraft. Remember the Lords of War series in Draenor? One of the best things we ever got out of that expansion, really. Blizzard noticed how well it was received and continued the series, now called Harbingers. Same artistic direction, same motives. It served to introduce us to some of the new key characters that we would be befriending or cutting down during this expansion, namely Khadgar, Illidan, and my favourite Harbinger by far, Gul'dan. I've also linked a playlist with these below because they're worth a rewatch. They are also incredibly well done. They show us a bit more into these characters, what drives them, how they became as they are, and why we should care about them. Wait, what? Illidan's back? Didn't we defeat him in Black Temple? Yes, well, sort of no actually. See, he was locked inside a crystal, which Gul'dan planned to use as a vessel for Sargeras' return to Azeroth, but well, that didn't quite go to plan, as we'll see later. On the subject of returning characters, we had just as many leave us. The story of Legion was a real shocker and a mix-up to the character and lore meta. No important character was safe as we took on the Broken Isles. The Varian fell heroically to defend his people and allow their safe escape. Vol'jin, the then war chief as the Horde, was also lost in initial conflicts, naming Sylvanas the new war chief. Tyrion Fordring, a beloved paladin and big character in lore, was also defeated at the hands of the Legion. Suddenly everything that had been built up for years and years came crashing down. Anduin's now the king. Again, Greymane gets a much more important role in the Alliance. Sylvanas is war chief. The Ashbringer has no wielder. And where on earth is Thrall in all of this? Even later in the expansion, the names Turalyon and Illyria are spoken for the first time in years and years, as it turns out they've been on an intergalactic crusade of their own for some time. We see Illidan free, defeat Kil'jaeden on a spaceship as he tried to flee the tomb of Sargeras, pull Argus, the planet, within the range of Azeroth. We go to the home planet of the Legion, set up our base, and then even defeat the world's soul, Argus the Unmaker. Imagine that. We see the Pantheon. We imprison Sargeras just before he stabs Azeroth with a giant flaming sword he conjures, and Illidan becomes his jailer. I mean, stop me if I'm wrong, but this sounds like the coolest stuff ever. It's also grand and larger than life. And Legion was packed with so many moments where people lost their mind at how cool it was. Remember this moment here where Illidan appears behind Gul'dan, and how about the first moment when you actually realize that we're going to be going to Argus? Nobody expected this, nobody predicted this. Legion delivered such a fantastic story, and that was just the main storyline. We haven't even talked about the zones themselves, or a certain endgame zone which was fully story driven, and one of the most iconic zones Blizzard has ever, no wait, I'm gonna say it, arguably the most iconic zone Blizzard has ever created, Suramar. More on that later, you can bet. On top of all of this, Legion was packed with references to older versions of the game. It was like a celebration of World of Warcraft's history. Here's just a few. This line from Illidan, first from Warcraft 3, second just after Kil'jaeden is defeated. The way in which Khadgar arrives to warn Varian of the return of the Legion being ever so reminiscent to Medivh's warning for King Terenas. Though Khadgar was a bit more direct. You know, maybe Medivh would have got his point across if he wasn't quite so vague. How about this though? After Illidan toasts Gul'dan holding a skull, just as he did in the TBC cinematic or at the top of Black Temple in TBC. And these are just a few examples. Legion is full of stuff like this, awesome moments for both WoW veterans and fresh players that everybody can enjoy. We also got our third new class, one that was far more well received than the Monk ever was, a class which, like the other ones, also had foundings in other Blizzard game, and a class that we had so often been facing off against in raids and dungeons rather than playing alongside them directly, the Demon Hunter. And given all the cool new looks, tattoos, forms, and cosmetic options they had, you know what people really went wild for? The fact you could do this. Now that's what players want. I'd have to put the Demon Hunter initial reception not quite up there with the hype levels that Death Knights had, but certainly way higher than the poor monks. As for their initial tuning, I think Blizzard did a much better job than either of the previous two new classes that they had released. Death Knights were just blatantly overpowered, monks were sort of just okay. Demon Hunters were certainly a bit OP, but not to the extent that nobody could ever compete with them at all. I don't mind a rather OP launch to help hype the class up a little bit. I think it does good for the game, and then they were gradually toned down throughout the course of the expansion. They were also the first class to release with just 2 specializations, since Blizzard didn't see the need to try and fit in a third when they only really make sense tanking or doing DPS, which, thinking about it, completely makes sense and allows you to have much more control over getting balance correct with this new class. Anyways, I'm not going to talk about them in too much detail here because you know I'm going to have to do a full video about Demon Hunters in Legion, so look out for that one coming soon. Okay, I should probably make a start on some of the actual expansion features now, I guess. Remember the pre-launch event we had with the demon invasions throughout Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms? This was the biggest pre-launch event we'd seen in ages, and it was very well received overall, as not only was it fun to take part in, but it rewarded good gear to go into the new expansion with, as well as limited time availability toys and pets, which people stacked up such an unbelievably large amount of that they still even aren't that expensive to this day. It was also a good place to test out your character and the changes that they had received pre-launch as well, because in Warlords of Draenor, even Blizzard acknowledged that they'd taken too much away and stripped away a big portion of your class's identity. Legion would literally introduce hundreds of new talents, and that was just for PvE. PvP now had their own talent tree by itself, which we can discuss later. In Legion though, many classes honestly felt pretty good by themselves, but much of the power that we would gain throughout the duration of the expansion would be done through an entirely new system known as artifact weapons and legendaries. However, before we talk about them, we need to know, was Legion leaked? Well, sort of. I mean, here's what was leaked from 4chan of all places. Some of it's spot on, other bits are a bit, questionable, shall we say? It's an interesting read actually, I'll link it below. You have to wonder sometimes whether this stuff comes from Blizzard to hype people up or people with just very active imaginations. Anyways, Legion is here, we do our Broken Shore scenario, which basically, you know, go there, kill demons, the usual stuff. And then we're ported to Dalaran again. Yes, we're going to use Dalaran again because it's a magical floating city. You can do whatever you want with it. And shortly after we arrive there, an NPC finds you and gives you a quest. This quest will introduce you to your class Order Hall. Class Order Halls, a big talking point of Legion and a real drive from Blizzard to give each and every single class some form of home which would embody the class fantasy of whatever you were playing. They also wanted them to serve as another central hub rather than just having everybody in Dalaran all the time. I think Class Order Halls were great, and each and every one is immediately distinguishable from the next. I bet you could figure out which one is which only after having been there for a short period of time. Druids had the Dream Grove, as well as the Emerald Dreamway, Shaman the Maelstrom, DKs had Akerus, Warriors Skyhold. I like to think Class Order Halls as a sort of communal garrison, but they didn't need you to be there all day, every day. Whilst they look great, were thematically awesome, lended much to the flavour of your class, they were designed to be visited only for a short period of time at once. You check in, recruit followers, send missions off, which were now of much less importance than Warlords of Draenor, empower your artifact weapon, and get disappointed from your Mythic Plus chest, and then use the map to start off new questing zones. That was kind of it for its use, and that's fine. There are of course various meta quests that popped up there, such as when Kalagos appeared to start off the whole Illidan quest series, and there were definitely some Class Order Halls which were a bit cooler than the others. You're going to have a pretty tough job selling me, for example, the Rogue one, which was literally a sewer, is as cool as the Hunter one, who had an entire lodge up in High Mountain. Maybe it's a bit more down to personal preference. The sewer is very roguelike, and you do get a black market auction house there, so that's pretty cool. It was also in our order halls we got to start working towards our artifact weapons. Now this was the selling point of Legion, and I think it was done very well. Telling players you're going to be able to wield legendary weapons like Doomhammer or the Ashbringer. For every single class there was a quest for your weapon. for every single class, for every single specialization in the entire game. Okay, quite a few of them had some crossovers where you go to similar areas. I remember, for example, Moonkin had Cypher Valoon and Affliction Warlocks had Orthalesh Deadwind Harvester, which both needed you to visit Karazhan again. Artifact weapons meant that for once, one equipment slot was filled already throughout the entire expansion really, which started off as a real concern, as weapons are typically one of the coolest and most important items that you can receive, especially as melee classes. But Blizzard made sure that there were so very many different customizations that each person looked a little bit different, and there was dozens and dozens of different looks for every single weapons, not just recolors either, some of them changing how your complete appearance looked as they stood out so much. We also had hidden appearances as well. These came from a massive variety of different mini quest series and were left entirely up to the player base to discover. I remember having to farm mobs in Suramar on my Fire Mage to get the quest. Frost Mages needed to have a portal network set up, and randomly you would have a portal that would teleport you to Frostfire Ridge, and you claim your reward there. Arcane was far more complicated. We had to sheep up certain critters that would appear in your order hall before taking a quest that would lead you to different characters in and around Stormwind before finally getting the appearance. I remember the hidden artifact appearance for Demon Hunters needing you to farm something that would pull down an elite mob from above Fell Soul Hold until players realised you could just glide all the way from Dalaran over to where it was and tag it. There were appearances from PvP, raiding, quest meta achievements, and then the Mage Tower or challenge mode appearances later on in the game. We're going to be talking more about this fantastic bit of content later as well. But these didn't just look great. If you had the Mage Tower appearance early on, everybody knew that you were a solid player. The majority of them were extremely challenging to get, as befitting of the name of the content. I remember getting mine on my Frost Mage done after a number of attempts and theory crafting out the best way to do it, and you felt awesome after having your appearance done in week 1. Oh, and it gave us the Werebear as well. And in time, players got more and more gear, and therefore this content became more accessible for the majority of players too, which is a perfect way for things to be done. But enough about how the artifact weapons looked. What did they do in terms of performance? A huge amount is the answer. Our classes were okay without them, but they were certainly missing some power though. From the moment you equip your artifact, you gain a new ability. Many of these abilities were core to how your class played. Phoenix Flame for mages, BM Hunters getting a second pet, Shadow Priest having Void Torrent which paused their insanity decay, Moonkin had the moon cycle spells from half to full moon, Fury Warriors had Odin's Fury, or Stormkeeper for Elemental Shaman. There was barely a dull moment with artifacts, and this isn't even talking about the extra unlocks we get as we progress through upgrading our artifact weapons, which had some of the best things that have ever been put into the game, like Juggernaut for Fury Warriors, meaning they had basically endless execute scaling, Moonkin's big cooldown granted haste with how many spells were cast during it. My favourite passive ever to have been put in the game for Affliction Locks, Soul Flame, meaning whenever something died it did an AoE around it, and this could chain infinitely, so when you pulled loads of mobs it was just glorious to watch them all go up in a big chain Soul Flame. Add on top of that, later down the expansion we also got further new abilities during the Legion full patch, and well, artifact weapons was something that you were constantly working on, and that's not to say they were perfect. I certainly do have some criticisms over how various parts of them were handled, mainly around respecking, changing traits and the pure grind to hit your elite traits early on, but they gave our classes so much more. One of my favourite parts of Legion was all the new ways each and every spec was made special in some way and just looked cool. And all of this was made possible through artifact weapons. Another new feature that was pushed in several areas were allied races. This one was pretty unexpected overall actually, seemingly coming out of nowhere. Now we had Nightborn, High Mountain Tauren, Mag'har Orcs for Horde, Void Elf, Lightforged Draenei, and Darkhind Dwarves for Alliance. Also, these were locked behind doing a lot in game 2, of course, mainly questing and getting reputations to Exalted, and I think people were pretty hyped to see races that we'd known for ages, as well as some new ones join the ranks of the Alliance and the Horde. And along with the Heritage armor, which would certainly have many people interested in getting some alts going to play these new races. I'll touch on allied races in more detail a bit later on though. Let's finish this one up by looking at the PvP changes. Just like many other aspects of the game, Legion looked to completely shift up how the PvP scene was going to work in WoW. The age-old conversation of there being one set of talents for PvE and PvP was finally addressed. Legion had a full set of talents designed just for PvP that could be balanced for PvP, and that was supposed to bring PvP balance to a much better place than it had been in for a long time. With this also came changes so that gear was so much less important than it had ever been for PvP. Here's a quote from Blizzard themselves. "In this new system, the significance of gear will be heavily scaled down, with the best gear in the game providing perhaps a 7% advantage over a character who has just reached max level." On top of this, PvE enchants, trinkets, set bonuses and gems were all removed from PvP. Blizzard were attempting to address the long-standing issues. They wanted PvP to be more fair, balanced, and above all, based upon player skill, not a player having a Titanforge draft of souls and pressing Battlecry at the same time, which would have insta-melted any player under a CC effect. That combo, of course, was completely nuts in its own right, though. All of this degeneracy was still in world PvP, of course, but in battlegrounds and arenas, things changed. On top of this, there was the whole prestige system. Here's how it went down. As you PvP, you gain honor levels. At certain honor levels, you can unlock a PvP talent, which would only be active inside instance PvP zones, like battlegrounds or open world PvP objectives, such as the Warden's Tower in Stormheim, for example. Once you hit honor level 50, you could prestige, which would unlock certain benefits, like an updated portrait look, battle pets, mounts, or a title. Initially, prestiging reset your honor talents too, which was pretty questionable, but this was changed sometime after. So how was all of this received? Well, what was also gone were PvP vendors. Getting an upgrade was like a slot machine of RNG. For a casual player, it was good overall. Less emphasis on gearing, low barrier to entry to get all PvP talents you could respec fairly easily. For the more hardcore players though, the long-standing PvPers, the reward structure was severely lacking. On one hand, there was less burst, on the other hand, there was so much more gradual damage that it was very hard to kill healers. And well, PvP still wasn't in a good place, even after all of the changes. Though, if I'm honest, I didn't really PvP all that much anymore come Legion. So you guys who are more into it will have to let me know your experiences and how you felt it all played out. So I'm going to end this one here because I still have such a massive amount to talk about. It's unreal. Legion will probably end up being the longest part of this series I'll ever do, which I really didn't expect that. Well, I'll just have to see how it all plays out. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me on part 1. I will see you for part 2 very soon as we continue to look at how did Legion change World of Warcraft. If you like what you see, give the video a like and subscribe as there'll be plenty more to come. Take care guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.